Hello and welcome to our weekly look at events inside Syria. I'm Mike Hanna. Civilians and opposition fighters in Aleppo face the most serious and sustained shelling yet, and some contend the main battle for control of Syria's second city is well underway. But with neither the Syrian army or the rebels showing any signs of backing down, an apparently permanent and bloody stalemate may be looming. All this while the UN General Assembly passed a resolution condemning the violence and criticizing a Security Council that remains divided on the issue. But the General Assembly resolution was strongly opposed by, among others, Russia and China, two major powers that have repeatedly used their vetoes in the Security Council to block real action on the Syrian issue. This report from Jane Ferguson.
Aleppo city remains the epicenter of the Syrian civil war. This activist footage, which can't be independently verified, appears to show a continued bombardment by the government. The rebels control around a third of the city, but the government has started a new offensive to crush Free Syrian Army elements there and have been sending reinforcements for several days. And it seems that diplomacy won't be able to stop the ongoing battle. Bickering at the UN has finally caused its special envoy to Syria, Kofi Annan, to step down. The move is viewed by many as a collapse of diplomatic hope on Syria. Meanwhile, a Saudi-backed resolution has been passed, slamming the Syrian government for its use of violence. The Syrians were outraged.
This draft has no impact whatsoever. On the contrary, it will help the Syrian government increase its serious efforts in order to bring about a peaceful settlement to the Syrian domestic crisis, which is not anymore a domestic, as you know. It has an international dimension and a regional dimension and a very negative Arab dimension.
The Arab dimension, he mentions, a throw to Syria's stance that Saudi Arabia and Qatar are arming the rebels to increase Sunni control in the region. But however heated the arguments in New York become, now that diplomacy has no more suggestions, the war will continue to drag on. Jane Ferguson for Inside Syria.
Well, to discuss all of this, let's go to our guests. Here in the studio is Louay Safi, member of the Syrian National Council. From Washington, D.C., David Mack, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs. And from Moscow, Demitri Babich, political analyst and writer for the news website Voice of Russia. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with David Mack in Washington. Does any hope of a diplomatic solution go out of the window together with the departure of Kofi Annan?
I think that it is a blow to diplomatic efforts. You always want to have an experienced, qualified mediator who can talk to all parties, but it does not mean that it will be impossible. The United States has made clear it will continue to deal with governments in the international community that are trying to achieve some kind of peaceful negotiated resolution. I will say, for my own part, that would include Russia, even though we are extremely disappointed by the position that Russia has taken thus far and scuttling the efforts of the Security Council to provide some real strength and backing to Kofi Annan.
Well, we'll pick up on the divisions within the international community, but I'd like to go to Demitri Babich in Moscow with that particular question about, is this an end to a diplomatic initiative?
No, I don't think it's an end. I think certainly sooner or later the whole affair will have to end with a negotiated settlement. After all, we had a civil war in Lebanon which continued for 14 years, and it ended with a settlement. But no one now even remembers which side in this war actually won. I think the end was that there was some kind of a truce between warring parties. And that's exactly what Moscow would like to see in Syria. The West, the United States and the European Union, they have been pushing just for the resignation of Mr. Assad, saying that if he resigns, everything will be okay. in a few years or in a few months or in a few weeks. That doesn't satisfy Russia. We think that there should be a negotiated solution, and Mr. Assad's resignation should follow some kind of a settlement. It should not precede it. So I think basically, if you remember the meeting that Mr. Putin recently had with the British Prime Minister and Mr. Obama's meeting with other Russian officials, I think with with Mr. Putin and with Mr. Medvedev. The whole idea is that after these talks, our leaders came out to the journalists, and it transpired that we had a lot more things in common than we had differences.
Well, I will let you respond to that on a moment, David Mack in Washington, but to go to Louay Safi here in the studio, we heard there the rather bleak words, 14 years that it took to reach a settlement in neighboring Lebanon. Do you think that there is any space whatsoever still for a diplomatic resolution to what is happening in Syria?
Well, I think the best solution is a political solution. And the only way for that to happen is for Russia to stop supporting the dictator. To say, all right, we are going to support transition, democratic transition, and Assad has to step down, step aside, because he has been the main impediment for any political solution.
Well, David Mack in Washington, D.C., to follow up on what we were hearing from Demitri Babich about the timeline here, the differences between the international community, specifically Russia and China and many others in the international community. Do you see this as a critical point in preventing a peaceful resolution to this increasingly violent conflict?
I think it's part of a continuum. I agree with Dimitri's observation that it could go along for a long time before the parties are ready to reach some kind of negotiated solution. I do think, however, that we're at a point where the levels of bloodshed could get much higher unless some kind of political transition process gets underway. Whether that involves Bashar al-Assad leaving power immediately or not is a different question. As Demitri and Louay, your other guests, well know, the United States persevered for some time trying to work with Bashar al-Assad to establish some kind of dialogue between his government and the opposition, and he just didn't want to go that direction. It was always offering way too little, way too late. So I think the question really for the Syrian opposition would be, will they be willing to work with regime figures who could ease Bashar al-Assad into retirement, just the way Yemeni rebels worked with figures in the Yemeni government, and the United States, which had a very close relationship with Ali Abdullah Saleh, made certain that he had a comfortable retirement where he could no longer manage the affairs of the country.
Well, let's put, if I may just interrupt you at this point, David Mack, apologies, but I'd like to put that question directly to Louay Safi. Would you be prepared to engage in that kind of dialogue?
Well, the opposition wants one thing, wants transition to democracy. Anyone who can help in doing that, a genuine, real transition to democracy, the opposition is willing to talk with. And of course, the only condition is that these individuals should not be among those who have been directing the massacres and the killing in Syria. So it must be a respectable person, not outside the security apparatus.
But by that you are completely excluding the members of the present government of Syria, are you not?
Well, we will exclude for sure the chief of security in Syria and definitely the president. There's much of blood on the hands of Bashar al-Assad to be able to be part of negotiation. Over 20,000 Syrians have been killed using heavy bombardments.
Well, Demitri Babich in Moscow, there we hear a position being stated that there cannot be dialogue until Bashar al-Assad goes, and yet that is directly at odds with what Russia is arguing at this particular point, is it not?
Well, I think the problem is not with Russia. The problem is with Syrians, because obviously if the regime has been able to fight for 1.5 years, we can expect it to fight for at least a few more months, maybe a few more years. And that means a lot of bloodshed. So Russia suggests that the Syrian government be made part of the equation, not because we like that government so much or because we want to get something from it. I think everyone understands that Russia is not going to get any money from Assad. In fact, Russia has written off the Syrian debt, $11 billion, just 3 or 4 years ago. So, Russia is pushing for a negotiated settlement primarily because it's quite obvious that the Syrian society is badly split. And unless the interests of the minorities are taken into account, the minorities being Alawites and Christians, there can be no easy solution. We live through a civil war in Russia, and we know that it's terrible when just one side wins 100%, because usually the victors take a terrible retribution on the vanquished.
Well, David Mack in Washington, here we've got an international community deeply divided. We've had 3 Security Council resolutions being vetoed by China and Russia in particular. But ultimately, this may be saying as much about the international community as it does about the problem that it is debating. Is there a role anymore, it would appear, for some kind of concerted international action? Or have the events of the past few months in the international world completely denied this possibility?
No, I certainly think that the international community can play an important role and probably will have to play a role at the end of this process. However long the current fighting goes on, eventually efforts are going to have to be made to bring the parties into a negotiating scenario. And they're going to have to also, after the end of negotiations, assuming they are somewhat successful, you're probably going to have an international peacekeeping force and a requirement for an international peacekeeping force. Historically, that's something that the United Nations has been able to do in situations once the conflicting parties reach a truce of some kind. That's even been true between Israel and Syria, for example, where the United Nations continues to play that role. Finally, there's going to be the need for a huge humanitarian and economic reconstruction effort that can take place through means other than the United Nations, but the United Nations can play a very important role. I might also say that if at the end of the day there's going to be free elections, the United Nations is the body that has the greatest expertise for helping conduct such elections, as it has just done in Libya, for example, with a fairly high degree of success in a country that had not had a real election since 1952.
But all of this is looking forward to something down the line and is looking forward to some form of agreement being reached in the first place. Louay Safi, it does appear that the possibility of this is very remote at the moment. If there's no preparedness from the opposition to talk to those in government, then where does it begin? Are you going to rely on some outside interlocutor to actually force through an agreement? Or is it going to be done on the ground? Is force now the dominant agent of change?
Well, the Syrian people are determined to change the government into a democratic one, to get rid of the current regime. Now it's all in the hands of Russia. If the Russians will take out their support for this particular person named Bashar Assad, then I think we can hope for a political solution. But the problem is that they are giving him more support, and he is using that support to kill people. And the more this war is prolonged, then I think we'll end up with the very scenario described by Demitri. But if we can now stop it, and Russia can be a major player in stopping this war, then I think we could have a completely different outcome.
Well, David Mack, do you think it's simple as that, to actually get Russia to switch its position, and that would be the determining factor in achieving an agreement?
Well, I'm encouraged by the fact that Louay has left open the possibility that Russia would play such a constructive role. And I certainly believe that somebody with the background and experience and self-confidence of Vladimir Putin would see that Russia's long-term strategic interests are involved in having a good continuing relationship with Syria and with the institutions of the Syrian government, not with any particular individual. Who knows? Maybe there will be some Russian statesman who will come forward, offer his services to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who has said that he's going to be seeking for a successor to Kofi Annan. I'm inclined to doubt that a Russian would fill that bill at this point, but I certainly hope they will play a constructive, supportive role.
Demitri Babich, do you believe that Russia is acting in its own interests or in those of Syria? Is it really, truly attempting to get a peaceful resolution, or is it more intent on maintaining its sphere of influence in that region?
Well, I think that if you analyze the latest political developments, you see that Russia was actually the country that was pushing for a political solution all the time. You know, the Geneva agreements where Mr. Annan actually talked about a coalition government for Syria. For the first time, there was a talk of a coalition government. Russia was enthusiastic about this agreement, and it signed that agreement, but it was badly underreported in the West, and it was forgotten next day when Mrs. Clinton was chairing the so-called Friends of Syria meeting and started talking about Russia having to pay some kind of a price for its position. Basically, our foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov, said several times that our Western partners are asking us to ask Assad to step down. Mr. Lavrov said that even if we asked him to step down, he would not follow that advice. The situation is too dramatic. We see what's going on in Syria. I don't think Mr. Assad or the opposition will listen to some outsider, and after all, Russians are outsiders in this situation. We didn't live in that region. We don't know all of its realities.
Well,
so I think the real battle is on the ground.
Yes, well, this is a particularly important point. If I may, Demitri, let me just go to Louay Safi on that particular point. We've been talking here about the international community, what it can do or what it can't do, but surely in the end, the resolution has to be met by the parties within that country. In other words, a Syrian solution by Syrians themselves.
I agree with that. The problem is now, this kind of argument that the Russians are trying to negotiate peaceful settlements doesn't wash, because it is the support, continuous support in the Security Council and in constant supply of arms that is keeping the Assad government there. And so the Syrian people have become more convinced that now the blood in Syria, the responsibility for that blood shared by the Russian leadership. And I hope, I have true hope that the people there recalculate, their interests. The long-term interest is with the Syrian people and with the people in the region, not with the Assad himself. And I don't know why they are stuck with that guy who has shown repeatedly that he is not serious about anything, including peaceful resolution.
And yet, while this debate, this discussion, this argument continues, and while people continue to die on the ground in Syria, you also have a scenario emerging where the opposition is beginning to splinter. There are signs of division among the opposition itself. The longest this crisis lasts, the longer it lasts, then perhaps the less likelihood that of an opposition that remains united, which multiplies the problems in any post-Assad government that may emerge. So is there not a duty on the opposition to actually engage, to find some way to break this stalemate, as much as there's an obligation on the Syrian government?
The opposition wanted from day one. There was no talk about regime change. We wanted reform. But that person in the Bashar Assad continued killing, people who were demonstrating peacefully. There were no arms at the beginning. But he kept killing, sending his gangs, raping women, and that in Syria is a big thing. Really, this part of the Council of Honor that can stir a lot of troubles. And so ultimately people took up arms. still the war is imbalanced. I mean, you have here tanks and MiG, the fighter jets from Russia used to bombard cities, and then the Free Syrian Army is armed with very light weapons taken mainly from the Syrian army. So I think something has to happen. The international community has to step in to make sure that the bloodshed will not continue, because it can continue. It will continue for years, but definitely the price could be very high, and then the Russians will have to deal with that squarely.
Well, David Mack in Washington, we hear there about an unequal and uneven playing field. Will the interests of Syria be served by making that playing field more level? In other words, by arming the opposition, thereby adding to the intensity of the conflict?
Well, there's a lot of, I think, simplistic suggestions coming from some quarters in the United States, and also from some of the Syrian opposition groups for U.S. military assistance of various kinds to even the playing field. I don't view this as some kind of a game. I do think that the U.S. government has been wise to be very restrained in the kind of assistance it provides to the Syrian opposition. Essentially, we've been trying to help the Syrian opposition unify its ranks politically and to try to come up with some kind of planning on the part of the Syrian opposition for negotiations with the government, for dealing with the international community, and for eventually building itself up as a possible player in a future elected government. That's all well and good, but our experiences of 12 years dealing with the Iraqi opposition, and I have a personal involvement there, we know that a lot of what we tried to do did not turn out very well. That experience is not so far in the background that the United States government is going to yield to these pressures to do a lot of things, such as providing modern arms, such as establishing a no-fly zone, which sound dramatic, but actually don't deal with the real problems that the Syrian opposition has.
Well, Demitri Babich in Moscow, what are those real problems from your particular viewpoint, and how can they most easily be solved at this juncture?
Well, unfortunately, even by reading the Western press, we see more and more reports about Sunni radicals and even Al-Qaeda participating in the fighting in Syria on the side of the opposition. And I would not agree that Russia is sending weapons to Syria now. Russia has no common border with Syria, and the Russian warships which are in the Mediterranean have not yet entered the Syrian ports. Meanwhile, Turkey, for example, officially gave portable missile anti-aircraft launchers to the Syrian opposition, 20 of them. And just recently, New York Times wrote that about 1/4 of the Syrian opposition forces is controlled by Al-Qaeda. So even if 1/4 of these 20 portable missile launchers, meaning 5 of them, gets into the hands of Al-Qaeda, I think it's a scandal. It's an international scandal because it's a deadly weapon.
A last word, if I may, from Louay Safi here in Doha, and a very brief response to that. Is the struggle in threat of being taken over by outside elements?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And this is part of the propaganda that is put out by the Syrian regime, supported by the Russians particularly. It's very sad because the Syrian people have been left alone. Anyone who have been watching closely what's happening in Syria would realize that this is a popular, uprising. People want freedom, and this regime really cannot rule anymore after bombarding cities with artilleries, with jet fighters, with rockets. So I think this is going to go until the end.
Well, that brings us to the end of this particular discussion. My thanks to our guests, Louay Safi here in Doha in the studio, David Mack in Washington, D.C., and Demitri Babich in Moscow. And thank you very much for watching. Remember, each hour around the clock, Al Jazeera's coverage of the situation in Syria continues. And there's even more information on our website, aljazeera.com. That's it for this edition of Inside Syria from me, Mike Hanna, and the team. Goodbye for now.